An hour before light, on the last dry morning of the worst year the valley could remember, the sound that moved across the low ground was not the sound of water coming in, but the sound of water going out, steady and patient and endless, running down and away through a made thing of stone, set into the earth at the foot of 110 acres, that no one in the county had ever wanted and had been glad to let drown. There was a woman standing at the head of that meadow with a lantern hung on a post beside her, and she was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at the water. She had a book open on a flat board tied to the post, and a stub of pencil warming in her cold fist, and she was writing down the hour and the mark the water stood at, the way she had written down the hour and the mark every dawn and every dusk for 7 years. And when she had set the figure down, she closed the book and folded her hands and watched the meadow empty itself, the way a person watches a thing they have earned and mean to keep. Behind her, along the high road that ran the length of the bottom, the wagons stood in a line that went back farther than the lantern could throw its light. There were men on those wagons who had empty barrels to fill, and men who had cattle bawling behind them for want of water, and men who had come with nothing but a bucket and a boy, and they had come in the dark, and they had taken off their hats, and they were waiting. They were the same men. That is the thing a stranger could not have known, standing there in the cold and the smell of turned black mud, that these were the very men who 7 years before had stood on the courthouse steps in the hard bright of a March noon and laughed at her out loud when the clerk cried her name and cried the price, and the price was $3.40. 110 acres of ground, $3.40. It comes to a little more than 3 cents an acre, if a man wants to stand in the road and figure it. And there were men in that line who had figured it once, in the sun, on the courthouse steps, and had laughed, and had gone home to their good dry farms, and thought no more about it. Remember that. Remember the price, because the price is the whole of it, and it will come all the way back around before this is finished, the way water comes back around to the low place it was first let out. What none of them understood, not that noon on the courthouse steps, and not for a long while after, was that the drowned meadow was not empty. There was something under it. There was a thing men had built with their 2 hands before this town had a church or a name, a thing of cut stone and old black iron sunk down beneath the sedge and the standing water, where no man living had ever laid eyes on it, and it had been down there in the wet and the dark all that time, waiting, dumb and patient and sure, the way a seed waits under snow it cannot feel, for a hand slow enough and stubborn enough to come and dig it out. Hers were the hands. But that is the far end of the story, and this is the near end, and between the one and the other lie 7 years and 1 drowned husband and a great deal of mud, and I mean to tell it all, and I mean to tell it slow, because it was not done fast, and it does not deserve to be heard fast. So we will begin where the town began it, which is to say we will begin with the thing they could not see. The thing under the meadow was a sluice gate. That is the plain word for it, though the men who first cut and set those stones had an older word, and the men who came after had forgotten there was any word at all. It was a low wall of dressed gray stone laid square across the throat of the creek, where the creek slid out of the meadow toward the river, and set into that wall was a heavy timber door hung on iron in a groove of iron, and the door could be raised by a windlass and dropped by its own weight, and when it was down it held the river's tide back out of the meadow, and when it was raised at the ebb, it let the meadow's water run off clean into the creek and away. It was a simple thing. A child, shown it working once, would understand it. It was the difference between 110 acres of the sweetest hay ground in the valley and 110 acres of black rotting water, and it was the whole difference, and it turned on 1 timber door in 1 stone throat, and for the better part of a lifetime not one living soul in that county knew the door was there. They knew the water. Everyone knew the water. The low meadow had been drowned so long that the oldest men could not honestly say they remembered it dry, and the sedge grew out of it thick as hair on a dog, tall and gray-green and useless, rank and sour, good for nothing a beast would eat, and nothing a man could cut. And in the still black pools between the sedge, the frogs sang all summer, and the fever bred all summer, and the mist came off it at dusk, and lay on the good farms up the slope like a hand laid over a mouth. Men who had lived their whole lives within sight of it called it the drowned meadow, and they called it that the way you would name a grave you had stopped visiting, and they had struck it off the tax book as waste, or nearly waste, taxed it almost nothing because it was worth almost nothing, and the almost nothing tax had gone unpaid for 9 years running because no owner would spend a real coin on water, and so it sat and so it drowned, and so it waited, with the gate under it that no one knew was under it, keeping its own counsel in the dark. To understand how a woman came to buy the water that had killed her man, and to understand why she of all people bought it, you have to go back 3 years before the courthouse steps, back to a girl of 20, which is what she was, and to everything she had, which was little, and I am going to count it out for you, because with her it was always the counting that told the truth. Her name was Della Voss. She had come into the valley at 17 behind a wagon and a husband named Tam, and by 20 she had buried the husband and kept the wagon, and I will tell you now exactly what she owned in this world the winter she was 20, because she could have told you herself to the last item without stopping to think, for she was a woman who knew what she had. She owned 1 yoke of oxen, 2 of them, a red ox and a brindle, named Buck and Star, both of them older than she would have liked, and one of them lame in a forefoot in wet weather. She owned the wagon they had come in, with a cracked felloe in the near hind wheel, that she had bound herself with wet rawhide and an iron band, and it held. She owned a plow with a chipped share and a grubbing hoe and a mattock and a felling axe and a splitting maul and a long-handled shovel and a coil of good chain that had been Tam's father's and was the best thing she owned. She owned an iron kettle and a skillet and a wooden trencher and 2 tin cups and 1 good knife. She owned the clothes on her and a change beside them and a wedding quilt and Tam's winter coat, which she had not been able to make herself burn or sell, and which hung on a nail behind the door like a man standing very still. She owned a lease on a 1-room house at the edge of the Renwick place that cost her $4 a quarter, and she owned a debt of $11 at the store in the town that she paid down at the rate of $1, and sometimes $1.50 whenever she had it, and she never once let it grow, not by a nickel, not in the worst month, because a debt that grows is a debt that has decided to own you. And she owned one thing more that could not be sold and could not be counted, and it was gone. Tam had drowned in the spring of the year she was 19, in the black water of that same drowned meadow, gone in after a heifer that had waded out into the sedge and got herself mired, and he had waded in after her, and the ground under the water was not ground. It was a thing that let a man down and closed over him without a sound, and the water kept him 3 days before it gave him back. She had stood at the edge of the meadow all of those 3 days and 2 of the nights, and she had watched the water, and the water had told her nothing, and given her nothing, and finally given him back gray and cold at the foot of the sedge, and something in her that had been loud went quiet then and stayed quiet for the rest of her life. That is where it began. That is where she learned the one thing she was ever known for, though the town would not know she knew it for 7 more years. She learned to watch water. She learned to stand at the edge of a thing that had taken everything from her, and study it without hating it, and remember what it did and when, and write it down. The town had decided about her long before she gave them the meadow to laugh at, and I want to be honest about how they had decided, because it was not with cruelty. It would have been easier for her if it had been cruelty. It was with pity, and pity is the heavier thing to carry. For a hard word you can set down and walk away from, but a soft one follows you home. They pitied her the way you pity a thing that has been marked. The poor Voss girl, they said among themselves, on the porches and at the store, and after meeting, the poor young widow, no people of her own, and her man in the ground, and not even a proper grave to him, drowned out in that filthy meadow chasing a $10 heifer, and her left with 2 old oxen and a broke wagon, and no more sense than to stay in a valley that had given her nothing but a hole in the ground. The kindest of the women brought her things, a crock of butter, a length of cloth, a basket at Christmas, and set them on her step and did not stay, and that was the kindest thing they did, and it was also the worst, because a gift you cannot refuse and cannot repay is a way of telling a person what you have decided they are. She took the gifts. She said thank you in a voice that had learned to be steady, and she gave nothing back that they could see, and so they decided she was proud on top of poor, which is the one thing a town will never forgive, and they left her more and more alone, and that suited her, because being left alone was the only wealth she had. What they could not see, because it made no sound and cost no money and looked like nothing at all, was that all the while they were pitying her she was watching. She watched everything, but mostly she watched water. She watched the creek rise and fall with the rains, and she watched the river back up into the low ground at the high tides and slack off at the low, for the river ran to the sea not 40 miles down, and it breathed twice a day the way the sea makes rivers breathe. and she watched the drowned meadow that had taken Tam, and she saw a thing the whole valley had stopped seeing because they had looked at it too long. She saw that the water in the meadow was not still. It was almost still, but at the very foot of it, down where the creek gathered to leave, the black water pulled, always toward the one place, slow and steady as a thing being drained through a stopped-up hole. And she thought about that pull for 2 years before she understood it. And she wrote down the marks, the height of the water at the foot of the sedge, morning and evening, on the backs of old handbills, and on a slate, and finally in a little bound book she bought for 11 cents off the store, and paid the 11 cents, and set it against her debt so it came to nothing. She kept the record. Nobody knew she kept the record. That is the whole of the mechanism of this story. That one poor watched-over girl kept a record of water no one else thought worth the ink. And I am telling it to you plain and early, so that when the gentleman comes with his papers, you will know she was ready for him 3 years before he was born to her sight. Now I have to tell you how the meadow came to drown, because a thing does not drown by itself. And the drowning had a lineage, and the lineage is the whole reason 110 acres could be bought for the price of a pair of boots. Once, and it was longer ago than the church and longer ago than the town, there had been a grist mill down, where the creek met the river, and the mill had been the reason for everything. The men who built the mill built the stone gate too, in the same year, of the same gray stone, because a mill wants water it can command and not water that does as it pleases, and they set the gate in the throat of the creek and they hired a man to keep it. The keeper's whole work was the gate. He raised it at the ebb and dropped it at the flood, day on day and night on night, twice a day and twice again, all the days of his life. And the mill ground the valley's corn, and the meadow above the gate lay dry and green, and gave the sweetest salt hay in 3 counties, hay that men came from the far side of the river to buy, because a gate that is tended turns tidewater into hay ground, the way a patient hand turns anything the water has spoiled. That was the meadow once, green to the eye, worth a farm, and the whole of it hung on one old man and one timber door. Then the old man died. He was the last of his line, and he had taught the work to no one, for the work looked like nothing, and paid like nothing, and no young man wanted it. And he died one hard winter, with the gate down against a flood tide, and there was no one to raise it. And in the same handful of years, the way troubles come in a company, the mill itself burned. It burned to the stone in a dry August, in a year men still named when they wanted to fix a date, and the miller was old and broke and had no heart to build it again. And the river was already turning the valley's trade to the new mill, down at the falls that ran by a wheel and not by a gate. And so the mill was never rebuilt, and the burnt sill of it went under the brush, and the water right that had belonged to the mill, the old written right to hold and let the creek, went into a drawer in a strongbox and was forgotten by everyone but the paper it was written on. And the gate, untended, with the door down and the iron rusting in its groove, began to catch the river's silt on its held-shut side, the way a comb catches hair, and the silt built, and the sedge seeded into the silt, and the sedge roots held more silt, and the tide crept over the top of the buried door, and could not get back out, and season by season, and year by year, the meadow filled and soured and rotted and drowned, and the men who could remember it green grew old and died, and the men who came after knew only the water, and called it the drowned meadow, and struck it off the book. And there is your lineage. A dead man, and a burnt mill, and a door left down. Every conventional soul who ever glanced at that ground did the conventional sum, that to drain 110 acres of tide-fed swamp, you would need money enough to hire 50 men and dig a mile of ditch and build a levee against the river. Money no farmer in that valley had ever seen in one place, and every one of them came to the same conventional answer, which was to leave it lie and pity the fool who did not. And so it lay. And so it waited. And under it, square and true and only sleeping, the gate. The county put it up at the March tax sale, the year Delavos was 23, for 9 years of unpaid tax. And the whole of the 9 years of tax on 110 acres of struck-off waste came to $3.40. And she was there on the courthouse steps in the cold March sun, with the exact coins tied in a corner of a rag in her pocket. Because she had already spent 3 years watching that pull of water at the foot of the sedge, and she had already come to know, the way you come to know a hard thing slowly and then all at once, that there was something down there making the water pull, and that a thing that makes water move against the whole weight of the land is a thing men made, and that whatever men made once, a patient hand could find again and set to working. The clerk cried the parcel and cried the sum and looked out over the steps for a bid, expecting none, meaning to strike it back to the county, and a woman's voice said $3.40, flat and even, and there was a silence of one breath while the whole of the courthouse steps turned to see who had spoken, and then they laughed. Boy, they laughed the way a crowd laughs when it is relieved to have something safe to laugh at, all together and loud and going on longer than the joke, the widow buying the water, the poor Voss girl buying her husband's grave for the price of a Sunday dinner, and one man called out to ask would she want a boat with it, and they laughed at that too. She did not laugh, and she did not color, and she did not look at any one of them. She walked up the worn stone steps through the middle of the laughing with her chin held level, not high and not down, but level, the way you carry a full cup you do not mean to spill, and she untied the rag and counted the coins into the clerk's hand, $3.40, and she took the paper he gave her, the deed to 110 drowned acres, and she folded it once and put it inside her dress against her, and she walked back down through the laughing and out into the road, and she did not run and she did not slow, and that was the last time the town ever laughed at Della Voss, though it would be 7 years before any of them knew the laughing had stopped for good. There was one man on the courthouse steps who did not laugh, and he was the poorest and the oldest and the least regarded man in the county, and his name was Cato. He was an old freedman, black and bent and gray at the temples, who had come north, nobody rightly knew how long ago, and lived alone in a hut on the river bank, and dug clams and speared eels and kept to himself, and men who wanted to be unkind said he was simple, and he was not simple. He had been born a slave on the rice ground of the Carolina Low Country, and he had spent the first 40 years of his life in water to his knees, tending the banks and the trunks of the rice fields. And a rice trunk, if you have never seen one, is a gate, a low timber door in a bank that lets the tide flood the rice and holds it and lets it off again. The same thought exactly as the thing sleeping under the drowned meadow, only made of wood and mud instead of stone. Cato had spent his life teaching water where to go, and he had watched the young widow buy the drowned ground for $3.40, while the county laughed, and he had watched her walk out through the laughing with her chin level, and when she came down into the road he was waiting for her, leaning on his eel spear, and he did not tip his hat, and he did not smile, and he did not say he was sorry, which was why she stopped and listened, for he was the first person in 3 years to speak to her, as though she were not a thing to be pitied, but a person who had just done a thing. He looked at her a while. Then he told her the one thing he had come to tell her, and he laid his broad, flat hand out level in the air, palm to the ground, and pushed it slow and even away from himself, toward the low ground and the river beyond, the way water goes when a door is opened for it, and he said, "Drowned ground never dies. It only waits on a patient hand to show the water the way back out." That was all he said. She looked at his hand, and she looked at his face, and she nodded once, and she did not thank him, because some things are too true to thank a man for, and she went home to the one-room house with the deed against her breast and Tam's coat on the nail, and she took down her little bound book, and she opened it to a clean page, and she began. The way she did it was the way the whole thing was ever done, which is to say slow, and by hand, and with 2 old oxen, and I am going to tell you the method plain, because the method is the argument, and if the method does not convince you, then nothing about her will. She could not hire 50 men. She could not dig a mile of ditch. She had 2 oxen, one lame in the wet, and a chain that had been Tam's father's, and a plan she had made in her head from 3 years of watching, and the plan was this. She would not fight the whole meadow at once, for a whole meadow is a thing that cannot be fought, but she could fight one rod of it, one narrow lane of it at a time, from the high end where the ground was only wet down toward the low end where the ground was drowned, and she would clear that lane of the rank sedge with the oxen, hitching the chain low to the base of the sedge and letting Buck and Star lean into the yoke and walk, slow and patient and enormous, and drag the sedge and its mat of roots up out of the muck by main strength, a beast's strength being the one strength she could command, and she would haul the tangled sedge to the high ground on the stone boat she built, which is a flat wooden sledge with no wheels that an ox can drag over ground too soft for a wheel, and she would pile it and let it rot down to make ground of it, and then she would come back with the drag, an iron-toothed harrow she made heavier with a log, and stones lashed across it, and set the oxen to dragging that lane over and over, back and forth. the teeth combing the muck and tearing the last of the roots, and letting the black water find the low lines and only start, to run. And every lane she cleared a little lower and a little nearer the foot. And every load of muck the drag turned up she watched, because she was working towards something, and she never once told a living soul what. It was the slowest work a body ever set itself to. I want you to feel how slow. The oxen could pull for only so long in the mire before their own weight foundered them, and she had to stop and let them blow, and stand trembling to the knees in the black water, and the lame one favored the forefoot, and she learned to work him only in the dry cold months, and rest him in the wet, and the sedge cut her hands to ribbons through the leather until her palms were a country of scars, and the muck stank of every dead thing that had ever rotted in it, and the fever, the same fever that came off the meadow every summer, took her twice and laid her shaking in the one-room house for a week each time, and each time she rose and went back down to the meadow, because she had learned that a thing you mean to have, you must go back to whether you feel like it or not, on the days you cannot bear it more than the days you can. She measured the seasons not by the calendar but by the ground. By the first autumn she had cleared and drained perhaps 4 acres at the high end, and it firmed enough by frost that she cut a little poor hay off it, a few loads of coarse stuff the oxen would eat if nothing better offered, and the town, when it noticed at all, noticed a widow cutting swamp grass, and shook its head, and pitied her the more. By the second autumn she had 8 acres, and the hay off the first 4 was no longer swamp grass but true grass, sweet, come in on its own out of the seed the old drained meadow had kept alive under the water all those years, for the ground remembered what it had been, the way she had known it would. By the third spring she had a heifer and 2 hogs off the sale of that hay, and she had paid the last dollar of the 11 at the store, and owed no man anything, and she had a boy. The boy was Amos. He was 9, or near it, when he first came to the meadow, and stood at the edge of it and watched her work. And he came because he had nowhere else to be, for the water had taken his people too, in its slower way. His father had farmed a low corner up the valley, that the creeping wet had ruined a field at a time, the fever coming off it every summer worse than the last, and the fever had taken his mother first, and then, the year Amos was 8, his father, and the low farm went for its debts, and the boy was passed among kin who did not want him, and finally not wanted by any of them. And he drifted down to the drowned meadow, where the strange widow worked her oxen, and he stood and watched, and she let him watch, and after a while she handed him the slate and the pencil, and showed him the marks, the height of the water at the foot of the sedge, morning and evening, and told him to set it down while she worked. And he set it down. He was grave the way children are grave who have watched too much go under too young. He did not chatter. He kept the record as though the record were the most important thing in the world, and by keeping it, he came to understand, before anyone else living understood, that the water at the foot of the meadow was pulling harder every season, that the more she cleared, the harder it pulled toward that one place, as though the meadow itself were straining to empty through a hole it could not quite reach. And one evening, in the 4th year, the boy looked up from the slate and said, "The water is trying to get out down there." And she stopped the oxen and stood a long while in the last light and said at last, "Yes, and now we are going to help it." And that was the winter they found the gate. It came up under the drag on a cold, clear day near the end of the 4th year, and it came up the way the most important things come up, without any warning, as a wrongness in the work. The oxen were dragging the harrow through the last low lane at the very foot of the meadow, the lane nearest the creek, the lowest and blackest ground of all, and the drag caught. It caught hard, harder than a root, harder than a stone, and Buck and Star lunged into the yoke and could not move it. And Della came and knelt in the freezing muck and put her scarred hands down into the black water to feel what had caught, and her fingers found not a root and not a boulder, but an edge. A straight edge, a cut and squared edge of dressed stone, running level and true off into the muck on either side farther than she could reach. An edge no river ever made. An edge that only a man with a chisel and a plumb line ever made. And she knelt there in the water, with her heart going, and her hands reading the stone, the way you read a face in the dark. And the boy stood over her not breathing, and she followed the edge with her fingers, and found the groove. And in the groove the iron, rusted to lace but there, and behind the iron, the top of a great timber door, swollen and black and sound. And she understood the whole of it at once, all 7 pieces of it, that she had been carrying separately for 7 years, the pull of the water, and the shape of the land, and the old man's flat pushing hand, and the sweet hay, come up out of nothing, and the lineage of the drowning, and the mill, and the keeper, and the door left down. And she sat back on her heels in the black water in the cold, and put her wet hand over her mouth. And she did not cry out, for she was a woman who had spent 7 years learning not to. But the boy said afterward that she stayed like that a long time, and that when she took her hand away she was smiling, and that he had never seen her smile before, not once. She began to dig the gate clear that same week, by hand, with the shovel and her fingers, the oxen dragging the loosed muck away, load by load, and it took her the rest of that winter and into the spring to lay bare the whole of the stone wall and the door and the iron and the old windlass frame rotted to punk above it, and to cut and fit a new windlass of green oak, and to work the door in its groove until the swollen timber loosened and rose, an inch, and then a hand, and then, on a gray morning in the 5th spring, with the boy holding the lantern, the whole of it, the door lifting groaning out of its bed for the first time in longer than any man alive had been alive, and the meadow's black water, the standing rotten water of 2 generations, gathering itself and beginning to move, slow and then faster, down toward the one open throat, and running out, and running out, and running out, through the gate, into the creek, and away to the river, with a sound like the whole low ground letting go a breath it had held since before she was born. And it was in the 5th year, when the water had begun to go and the ground had begun to come, when for the first time a man riding the high road could look down and see not swamp but the beginnings of green, that the gentleman came. He came in a light buggy with a good horse, dressed in a gray town coat and a clean collar, a soft-handed, pleasant man of middling years, with a leather case on the seat beside him, and he drew up on the high road and looked down at the meadow a long while before he came down the track to where she was working, and he got down carefully to keep the mud off his boots, and he smiled at her, and he took off his hat, which not one man of the county had done to her in 7 years, and he said what a remarkable thing she had done here, truly remarkable, that he had heard of it in the town, and had not believed it, and had come to see for himself, and now he saw it, and he was full of admiration. His name was Pruitt. He said he came on behalf of certain interests, a company, down at the falls, holders of an old and valid water right upon this creek, a right that ran back to the first mill, all quite in order, all a matter of record, and he was so very sorry to be the one to raise it. Truly he was, with all she had accomplished here. But the right to hold and let the water of this creek was his company's right, and had been for generations. And a gate upon the creek, this gate she had so cleverly uncovered, fell squarely under that right. And he had come, out of Christian regard for a hard-working widow, and wishing above all things to avoid any unpleasantness or ruin, to make her a fair and generous offer for her interest in the whole, the ground and the gate together, cash money, more money than she had likely ever held, so that she might walk away whole and easy, and let the company take up the burden of the water that was, after all, and he was sorry to say it, lawfully theirs. He talked a great deal. He had a way of talking that laid the threat down soft inside the kindness, so that you would feel the kindness first and only later, cold, feel the other thing, and he named a sum, and it was a large sum, and he watched her face when he named it. She had stopped the oxen. She stood with the chain slack in her scarred hand, and the boy a little behind her with the slate, and she looked at Pruitt for a while, the way she looked at water, studying it, remembering it, and she did not take the offer, and she did not refuse it, not yet. And she said only, in her flat and even voice, "The shortest thing," she said, "I will look at your paper." And he was so pleased at that, so sure it meant she was reasonable, that he opened his leather case right there and showed her the survey, a fine old survey on heavy paper with the company's claim marked upon it in red ink, and he let her hold it, and he talked on while she read it, and it was while he was talking on, easy and warm and certain, that he made the one mistake that undid him, for the smooth ones always undo themselves by talking. It is the only way they are ever undone. He leaned in and put his soft finger on the survey where the gate was marked, and he said, "Warm as anything, you understand. We have known this gate was down here the whole time. We have watched this parcel for years, waiting on the day it would be worth the trouble to take it up." She heard it. The boy heard it too, and looked up from the slate. "We have watched this parcel for years. We have known the gate was here the whole time." And she folded the survey along its old creases, slow, the way she folded a thing she meant to keep. And she handed it back to him, and she said nothing for a moment, and the nothing was an answer. And then she asked him, level and quiet, one question. She asked him where the mill was. He did not understand her. She asked it again. "The mill your right belongs to. Where is it?" And he began to say that the right was quite independent of. That the right ran with the water and not with the works. That these were technical matters a woman need not. And she let him finish. And then she told him, plainly and without any heat, the fact she had carried folded up inside her for 7 years, along with the deed and the record and everything else. The fact the whole county had forgotten and she had not. Because forgetting was a thing she did not do. "The mill burned 20 years ago this August," she said. "It was never rebuilt. And a water right is a right to run works. And there are no works. And there have not been works within the memory of that boy's dead father. And a right to power a mill that does not stand is a right to nothing. And it dies with the wheel it turned. And any court in this state will tell you so. And I have it written and dated and witnessed at the clerk's office in the town, the year of the fire and the fact of it, in the same book where your company never once, in 20 years, paid a penny of the tax on this ground, or lifted a hand to the gate, while I paid the tax, all of it, $3.40, and cleared the ground, and raised the door, in front of witnesses, for 7 years. She did not raise her voice for any of it. She reached into her dress and brought out, folded soft and worn to cloth, the deed, and behind it the tax receipt, and behind that a copy she had made in her own hand at the clerk's counter of the old survey and of the record of the fire, all of it dated, all of it witnessed, all of it kept, and she held them out for him to see, and did not let them go. And Pruitt looked at the papers in the widow's scarred hand, and he looked at the running gate, and he looked at the green coming up out of the black ground, and he understood that he had come a year too late and a fact too short, and that there was nothing here for him that talking could get, and the false sunshine went out of his face all at once and left it only tired. He put the survey back in his case. He said something about how these things were often best not pressed. He got up into his buggy, keeping the mud off his boots, and he drove back up the track to the high road and turned toward the falls. And he did not come again, not that year, nor any year. And the last the valley saw of him was the dust of his good horse going away. It was the next year, the 7th year, that the sky did the thing that turned the whole valley to her door, and it did it in the 2 cruelest ways it knows, one on the heels of the other. The spring came in wet, wetter than any man had record of, rain on rain for 6 weeks, and the river rose and came up out of its banks and over the good bottom farms, the dry green farms up the slope that had pitied her for 7 years, and drowned the young corn in the row, and rotted the seed in the ground, and floated the manure out of the yards. And the men who farmed the conventional way, on the high dry land the way sensible men do, stood on their porches and watched a year's work go under brown water they had no way on earth to stop. For you cannot argue with a river, and you cannot send it home. But down in the drowned meadow that was drowned no longer, Della Voss walked to the foot of her ground in the worst of the rain, and dropped the gate against the swollen river, dropped the door in its groove and let it hold, the way it was made to hold, and the flood that took the valley did not come into her meadow, because she had the one thing in the whole valley that could refuse it, a door in a stone throat and the knowing of when to shut it, and her hay grew green and tall behind the held gate, while the good farms drowned. And then, as though the sky meant to prove the whole matter past all argument, the rain stopped in June and did not come again, not a drop, for 11 weeks, and the wet spring turned into the hardest drought the oldest man could name. And the creeks went to stone, and the wells went to mud, and the corn that had survived the flood curled and burned and died standing in the field, and the cattle bawled on the cracked pastures with nothing to drink, and the same men who had been drowned in May were burned out in August, ruined twice in 1 year by water, first too much and then none. And Della Voss walked to the foot of her ground in the drought, and raised the gate at the ebb, and let the meadow water down slow into the pool she had shaped below it, and closed it again, and held a standing pond of sweet water through the whole burning summer, water for her stock and water to spare. And behind the gate, her 110 acres lay green as April, in the middle of a dying valley, because the woman who had spent 7 years learning the water could give the land a drink when the sky would not, The same as she could turn the river away when the sky gave too much. For that is what a gate is, and that is what the whole thing had always been about. The mastery of the water, not the fighting of it, the teaching of it where to go. And so they came to her. That is the morning we started with, and now you know how they got there. The long line of wagons on the high road an hour before light, the barrels and the buckets and the bawling stock and the boy on the seat, and every man of them with his hat in his hand. The same men, come down to the drowned meadow that was the only green ground and the only sweet water left in the valley, to ask the widow they had laughed at for a little of what she had, and she gave it. She did not turn one of them away, and she did not gloat over one of them, and she did not once say a word about the courthouse steps, for she had never been a person who needed to say a thing that was already true. But she was no fool, and I want to be plain about this, because it is the part that people who tell this story wrong always get wrong. She did not give it away. She set a price on her water and her hay and her ground, and it was a fair price, a real price, the true worth of the thing in a year when the thing was worth a great deal. And she took the money of the men who had money and did not blush to take it, for a thing earned is a thing that may be sold. But to the men who had nothing, the burned out and the drowned out and the ruined, the ones whose year was gone and whose children were thin, she sold on a word and a handshake, water now and hay now, and pay when your ground comes back, next year or the year after. No paper and no interest and no lien, only her hand held out and taken, and every debt of it written down in the little bound book in her own hand, the same book she had kept the water in, because she was a woman who kept the record, and the record now was a record of who owed her and trusted, and not one line of it was ever a line she meant to collect by force. That was the win. Not the money, though the money came and she was right to take it. The win was the handshakes, the whole ruined valley and her debt on a word, and no way for any of them to pretend any longer that she was a thing to be pitied. For you cannot pity a person you owe your children's lives to. You can only, at last, and it costs the proud among them dearly, be grateful. And the years after came the way the good years come, quiet and full and one on another, and everything that had been opened in this story closed, each in its place, the way water finds its level when the door is left where it belongs. Old Cato, who had told her the one true thing in the road that March day and asked for nothing, she went and found in his hut on the river bank the first autumn the meadow paid, and she brought him up to a warm dry room in the house she built at the head of the ground, and she gave him the keeping of the gate for wages, real wages, the work he had done for nothing his whole life now done for pay in his old age, teaching the water where to go on a northern creek the way he had taught it on a southern one, and he sat by the gate in the sun for the rest of his days, and raised it and dropped it and watched the meadow he had known would come green, and he died old and easy in his warm room in a hard winter with the gate down against the flood, and she buried him at the head of the meadow in the dry ground, with a cut stone over him, the only cut stone in that valley besides the gate. And the boy Amos grew, grave and steady, into the man who kept the record after her and the ground after her, for she taught him all of it, the marks and the seasons and the door and the whole patient art of the water, and he was to her the son the water had drowned before it could give her one. And the knowledge did not die when she began to fail, because it had somewhere to go, it had a hand to go into, the way the water always had somewhere to go once the door was clear. And Pruitt and his company and their dead paper right were never heard of again, gone the way the smooth ones go, quietly, into some other county with some other case, and the survey with the red ink went back into some drawer, and the drawer was forgotten, which is the only kind of ending men like that ever get, not a fall, only a fading. And Della Voss grew old at the head of her 110 green acres, the acres she had bought for $3.40 while a county laughed, a little more than 3 cents an acre, and she was not a rich woman by the measure of towns, but she was the woman the whole valley set its clock of gratitude by, and she never once, to the end of her life, missed the writing down of the water at the dawn and at the dusk. And at the very last, when she was old and bent and gray at the temples herself, there came into the valley a girl, a young thing, alone, with nothing, the way she herself had once come, a girl who had bought or been left some sour, worthless corner of low ground that everyone told her to walk away from. And the girl came to the head of the meadow one evening to look at the famous drained ground and the famous gate, and to see the old woman who had done the impossible thing, and she stood at the edge of it not asking anything, only looking, the way a person looks who has almost given up. And Delavos, who was old now and knew the shape of that looking better than anyone alive, came out and stood beside the girl a while and said nothing, and then she laid her broad, flat, scarred hand out level in the air, palm to the ground, and pushed it slow and even away from herself toward the low ground and the running water beyond, the way the old man had once pushed his, the way the water goes when the door is opened for it, and she said the one thing there was to say, the thing that had been waiting in her mouth for a lifetime to be handed on. Drowned ground never dies. It only waits on a patient hand to show the water the way back out. And the girl looked at the old woman's hand and looked at her face and did not thank her, because some things are too true to thank a body for, and turned to go home and begin. And the old woman stood on at the head of the meadow in the falling dark after the girl had gone, and did not go in, but stood and listened, as she had listened every dusk for a lifetime. And under all of it, under the wind in the sweet high grass, and the far bawl of the fed cattle, and the whole long quiet of the saved valley, there was the sound there had always been since the day she raised the door, low and steady, and never once stopping, going down and away into the creek and the river and the sea, the sound of the water going out through the gate.